I am Maya Collins, 30 years old, a freelancer in the creative industry living in Brooklyn, New York. That evening, in the small kitchen of my studio apartment, I had just placed a thin candle on a cheap birthday cake from the corner shop when the phone rang. It was the family lawyer, his voice low and dry, announcing that it was time to read my parents' will. I hadn't even swallowed the lump in my throat from the news that they were truly gone forever when the next words struck me like an icy slap. My younger sister, Savannah Collins, 27, an ambitious PR director, was to inherit the $750,000 mansion in Westchester along with most of the remaining assets. And me? I was left with a rotting wooden cabin somewhere in Alaska with smudged paperwork and unclear coordinates, nothing more than a cruel joke. As I closed the phone, Derek Sloan, my 31-year-old fiancé, a neatly dressed banker, smirked. He spat the words "pathetic loser" right in my face, tossed the engagement ring onto the chipped wooden table, and slammed the door behind him. The impact echoed so loudly that the whole hallway buzzed with whispers, leaving me standing there exposed in humiliation. Trembling, I opened the envelope of the will once more and discovered inside a rusted key, an old copy of a land deed bearing my grandfather Elias Mercer's name in Talkeetna, Alaska, and a thin slip of paper with a short note from my mother. "You will know why it had to be you. Have you ever been pushed to the kids' table of your own family, and where are you listening to this story from? Let me know in the comments before we uncover the secret hidden inside the cabin together." I was born into a family that, from the outside, looked perfect, but inside there was an invisible line that divided us sharply. My father, Richard Collins, was a civil engineer, the very image of middle-class America. Up at dawn, black coffee with no sugar, morning paper in hand, and a belief that achievement only mattered if it could be measured in numbers, in concrete poured, in bridges stretching across rivers. My mother, Elaine Mercer Collins, worked as a librarian at the local high school. She was gentle, patient, with the faint scent of old books lingering on the sleeves of her cardigan, but she was also someone who rarely contradicted my father. If he made a decision, she usually stayed silent, sometimes giving a small nod, as if already accustomed to the idea that her convictions were never strong enough to change the wind inside our home. My younger sister, Savannah, had been treated as a treasure from the moment she was born. She was beautiful, bright, and effortlessly social. She was always the prom queen in her friends' eyes, the pride of the school when she won debate competitions, the star cheerleader under the Friday night lights. I still remember those crisp autumn evenings when the whole town gathered at the high school football field. My father sat in the bleachers, shouting himself hoarse to cheer on the team, but, in truth, he was cheering for Savannah, waving her bright flag on the sideline. And me? I sat quietly at the far end of the bench, clutching the draft of an essay my English teacher had called outstanding. I handed it to my mother, hoping she would read it while waiting for the game to begin. But the essay was folded, tucked under a warm pizza box, and soon forgotten. That feeling that no matter how hard I tried, my efforts would never be enough to move anyone haunted me throughout my childhood. I, Maya, was always the one who carried the load. I started working part-time at 16, waiting tables at diners, serving coffee at the corner shop, saving every dollar I could to help cover the cost of books and school supplies. Savannah, on the other hand, was given her first car the moment she was old enough to drive, just so she wouldn't fall behind her friends. When summer came, my sister went to art camp while I flew to Anchorage to stay with my grandfather, Elias Mercer. I helped him fix up his wooden cabin, cooked meals, and listened to the stories he often shared on long afternoons by the Susitna River. He was the only person in the family who made me feel like I wasn't invisible. He would take me on walks along the river, sometimes in the biting cold of Alaska, sometimes under the glow of a fiery sunset, and tell me simple words that etched themselves into my memory. Never underestimate what others dismiss as worthless, Maya. Sometimes that's where the real key lies. As a child, I thought they were just words of comfort. But as I grew older, I began to see that my grandfather carried a belief completely different from my father's. While my father viewed the world through blueprints and calculations, my grandfather saw it through layers of time and patience. That difference made me feel as though I never fully belonged to my parents' world, yet I wasn't strong enough to stand against it either. I remember one moment clearly, in my senior year of high school, when I entered a national essay competition. My paper made it to the finals and was even published in a small academic journal. I came home excited, placing the printed copy on the dinner table. My mother gave me a faint smile, but my father only said, "What's the point of writing? Do you plan to make money off a few pages of paper?" Then he turned to Savannah, asking about her college applications, her choice of communications as a major, and how she intended to build her image properly. I sat there, listening to the clinking of forks and knives against plates, and felt as though my essay was nothing more than a scrap of useless paper. That moment became a scar I would never forget. It taught me that in my parents' eyes, real value only existed when it was flashy, easy to see, and easy to boast about. From then on, I understood why I chose a different path. I didn't measure life in numbers, in large houses, or in shiny new cars. I chose a career in content creation, a job many people call vague, unstable, even frivolous. I wanted to tell stories, to find meaning in small details. But that choice only made me fade further into the shadows of my family. Savannah was the opposite. She knew how to make everything shimmer, from her social media accounts to her polished resume. My parents loved that. They could proudly show off their youngest daughter to their friends, while I was rarely, if ever, mentioned in those conversations. Yet, it was those summers in Alaska, with my grandfather, that planted a different seed in me, the seed of patience, and the belief that sometimes the most broken, overlooked things carried a value no one else could see. I can still picture him leaning on his cane, pointing toward an old wooden canoe lying along the riverbank, half sunk in mud. He said, "Most people would call that junk, Maya. But if you know how to repair it, it could carry you farther than anyone imagines." I laughed then, thinking he was only speaking in riddles. I arrived at the will reading 10 minutes early. The law office was on the 23rd floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of cold, gleaming space where every footstep echoed like metal. I sat on a black leather chair by the window, holding a paper cup of water that had already softened from the sweat of my hand. Abstract paintings hung on the walls, expensive in color but void of feeling, making me feel like an unnecessary brushstroke. Savannah walked in right on time, wearing a camel trench coat, her hair in waves, her eyeliner sharp as a declaration. She smiled at the receptionist as if she were stepping onto a red carpet, then glanced at me with an expression halfway between pity and amusement. Behind Savannah came Derek, crisp white shirt without a crease, navy tie, and the cool scent of cologne. He didn't hold my hand. Instead, he gave me a polite nod, the kind meant to smooth things over, as if his role today was to make sure I didn't embarrass myself. The conference room door opened, and the lawyer, Mr. Levine, a man in his early 50s with thin-rimmed glasses and a silver fountain pen, invited us to sit. On the table lay a stack of files bound in cream covers embossed with the Collins name. The air was so heavy I could hear the wall clock ticking with every notch. Mr. Levine looked over at us, his voice steady and deliberate. "I'm sorry we meet under these circumstances. We will now proceed with the reading of the will." I clenched my hands, nails digging into my palms without pain. He began to read, the legal language steady and rhythmic, like the hum of a printer. The real estate located in Tarrytown, Westchester County, New York, appraised at $750,000, along with the majority of liquid assets, is hereby transferred to Miss Savannah Collins. A small "ah" slipped from Savannah's lips, not quite surprise, more like confirmation of something she had already believed. She glanced at me, the corner of her mouth lifting. "The trees in Tarrytown are beautiful. Perfect vibe for me." I swallowed hard. Mr. Levine continued. "The parcel of land and any structures thereon, designated Mercer Lot Hassan 4, situated at the forest edge of Talkeetna, Alaska, along with all related documents, is hereby transferred to Miss Maya Collins." He paused, as if expecting someone to ask for clarification, but no explanation followed. Only the faint scratch of his fountain pen filled the room as he signed off on the reading. I heard Derek let out a quiet laugh, the kind laced with contempt. Honey, glamping? Or should we just call it what it is, a shack? Savannah tilted her head, her voice sweet as syrup but edged with steel. Honestly, this suits you better. Rustic, reclusive, vintage, a little rough around the edges. I think it fits. I muttered, thank you, by reflex, the words falling onto the table like a shard of frosted glass. Mr. Levine closed the file and slid a thin manila envelope toward me, a key, a copy of the land deed, and a checklist of procedures to follow after transfer. Stamped on the cover was the old word, Mercer, in faded reddish-brown. I stared at that stamp the way one stares at a bruise just forming on the skin, not sharp pain, only a numbing weight. In that moment, I felt as though I were watching a play in which every role had been assigned long before Savannah the star, Derek the narrator, and me the backdrop. We stood up. In the hallway, where fluorescent lights made everyone look paler than usual, Derek turned to me, his voice low enough that the receptionist couldn't hear, but sharp enough that I did. I told you, Maya, life is about results, not feelings. I can't build a future with someone like this. The words like this hung in the air, heavy enough for me to feel their full shape. He tugged at his sleeve, adjusted his cufflinks, and delivered the final blow. Pathetic loser. I heard the faint metallic ping of the ring he once wore brushing against the receptionist's desk as he returned his guest badge. The receptionist looked up, startled. I gave her a small smile, an apology for bringing this scene into her quiet afternoon. Savannah leaned against the wall, scrolling her phone, her flawless face caught in the glow of the front camera. She leaned closer, her whisper carrying a hint of mint. Don't be sad, everyone has their own path. You know, the back-to-nature type. I didn't answer. My stomach felt hollow, as though wind were moving through it. Mr. Levine stepped out, offering a formal handshake. His gaze softened for a fraction of a second, perhaps because he had witnessed enough similar scenes to know exactly what I was swallowing. He said quietly, "Inside the envelope are detailed instructions. If you need, you can call me directly." I nodded, a thank you stuck in my throat. The elevator descended slowly, as if debating which floor of shame to release us onto. When the doors opened into the lobby, the noise of Manhattan crashed in honking horns, chatter, the smell of pretzels, exhaust fumes mingling with expensive perfume. Derek broke away without looking back. Savannah fastened the button on her trench coat, leaving me with a parting shot. You good? If you need a place to crash, I've got a guest room, but I figure you'd rather your meditation space. She winked and disappeared into the crowd. I stood at the edge of the curb, clutching the manila envelope like a paper life raft. In the glass of the tower, my reflection looked smaller than I imagined, as if the entire city had conspired to convince me that a person's worth could be measured by the facade they owned. A cold gust from the avenue cut straight through my thin coat, pressing into my chest, reminding me I had forgotten my scarf. I let out a small laugh, one with no witness. In my head, my father's words echoed. Life is a bridge, you either build it, or you stand aside and watch others cross. He never considered that there are footpaths through the forest that lead to the other side of the river too. I pulled the rusted key from the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. The head was faintly engraved with an M, the shaft marked by 2 diagonal scratches like old fingernail scars. Beneath the key lay a copy of the deed, the words Mercer Lot, Hasson 4. Talkeetna Periphery revealed like a treasure map for adulthood, a treasure no one else in that conference room wanted to touch because of its rough, shabby exterior. I wanted to run back upstairs, to ask why there was no explanation, why my mother never said directly what she meant, why my entire life seemed to be a series of cryptic notes. But then I understood, some questions, even if asked, no longer belong to you to hear the answers. At the top of the steps, my phone buzzed. A text from Derek, short and cold. I'll come get my things this weekend. Don't cry, have some dignity. Beneath it, a notification from Savannah's Instagram. A boomerang of the wrought iron gates of Terrytown, captioned, "New Beginnings." I drew in a deep breath, slipped my phone into my pocket, and pulled up my zipper. Shame, fury, and emptiness swirled like three concentric circles inside my chest, but at the center, there was something else, a small point that felt like the very idea of movement. I returned to Brooklyn that night, my small apartment sealed tight like a box, leaving only me and the manila envelope on the kitchen table. I sat staring at the rusted key under the pale yellow light, then at my phone, scrolling past Savannah's photos inside her new Terrytown mansion. In my mind, there were two clear choices: sell the Alaska land to some real estate speculator for enough money to cover a few months' rent, or go there myself and see with my own eyes what Lot Hassan 4 really was. The more I thought about it, the louder my grandfather Elias Mercer's voice echoed. "You will know why it had to be you." That night, I opened my laptop, my hands trembling but firm. I typed JFK to ANC Anchorage, Alaska. The ticket was expensive, I knew that, but I booked it one way. When the screen flashed confirmed, I felt hollow and weightless at the same time, as if I had just pushed myself out of the last comfort zone I had. The next morning, I began packing. This wasn't a vacation, it was a journey into a land so unforgiving that one careless mistake could leave me collapsed in the middle of the forest. I stopped by an outdoor gear shop in Soho, but soon realized the real essentials would have to be bought in Anchorage. So I gathered only the basics: layered warm clothes, insulated gloves, and a small leather notebook for keeping track of everything. I thought about what else I would need: a windproof synthetic down parka, waterproof high boots, an emergency survival kit, a lithium battery flashlight built for the cold, bear spray, something anyone living in Alaska would call mandatory, an offline GPS, a paper map, and a backup battery pack. I packed it all into the black hiking backpack that had followed me through smaller trails in the Catskills. But this time, I knew it would be carrying something heavier, an answer to years of being dismissed. The flight from JFK was long and bleak. On the way to the gate, I watched couples and families wheeling shiny suitcases, hugging travel pillows, buzzing with excitement for their vacations. I, on the other hand, carried nothing but an old land deed and a silent key. When the plane landed in Anchorage, the doors opened to a dense gray air, cold and dry, like 1,000 tiny needles pressing into my face. I zipped up my parka, inhaled that metallic chill, and knew I had truly stepped out of the world I once belonged to. Anchorage wasn't glamorous, it was practical, compact, with snow-lined streets, rumbling pickup trucks, and outdoor gear shops glowing late into the night. I stopped at Riai, a place packed with both locals and travelers, everyone speaking in the language of trail maps, route conditions, and snow depth. I picked up a few more essentials: a multi-tool knife, a water filter, an emergency tent, and a box of protein bars, enough to get me through if things went wrong. At the counter, the cashier glanced at my items and asked softly, "You're not just staying in Anchorage, are you? Talkeetna?" I froze, then simply nodded. She gave a short smile, the kind that suggested she had seen many like me people leaving the city to search for something in the cold. From Anchorage, I rented an old but sturdy AWD truck, and the company arranged for a local driver to take me closer to Talkeetna. His name was Tom, a gray-bearded man of few words, his hands calloused from decades gripping a steering wheel on icy roads. He only spoke occasionally, mentioning the weather or whether a trail might be closed that day. The truck drove for hours, cutting through forests blanketed in snow, frozen rivers glinting like silver mirrors, and scattered wooden cabins standing alone like stray notes in a song played too long. The sky hung heavy and gray, the line between clouds and snow erased, making the whole landscape look like an old painting smudged by time. When the truck stopped at the Talkeetna Roadhouse for me to rest, I stepped into a warm room filled with the smell of fresh pastries and strong coffee. The space was small, with low ceilings, and black and white photos of Denali climbers covering the walls. Locals sat in small groups, speaking just loud enough to be heard. No one asked too many questions, They simply nodded in greeting, as if they were used to strangers arriving here for reasons that didn't need to be explained. That kind of friendliness, neither intrusive nor prying, made me feel lighter than I ever did in my crowded Brooklyn apartment. I sat by the window, sipping thick black coffee, watching the snow fall outside, and felt the knot inside me loosen. When we left Talkeetna, Tom drove for several more hours before stopping at a trailhead. He pointed toward a narrow path almost completely buried under snow. "Your cabin's that way." "About a mile. I can't go farther." I nodded, paid him, and thanked him. He only nodded back, saying nothing more. I slung my backpack onto my shoulders, tightened the straps, and stepped into the forest. Each step sank deep into the snow with a creak, blending with the whistle of wind through the trees, until it was just me and the heavy silence. The GPS in my hand flickered with a weak signal, but enough to guide me forward. I knew there was no turning back. Through the entire walk, I thought about everything that had led me here. Savannah's victorious smile, Derek's contemptuous eyes, my parents' silence when I had needed them most. I wondered if I was running away. But then I answered myself, I hadn't come to Alaska for revenge, nor to prove anything to anyone. I came to face it, to open a door I had been told all my life would only lead to nothing. I took another step. Snow slid down my collar, ice cold against my skin, but it made me more awake than I had ever felt. As darkness settled, I saw in the distance a slanted wooden roof peeking through the trees. That was it, Mercer Lot Hassan for, the cabin my family had treated as a joke. I paused for a few seconds, inhaling the icy air, then walked forward. In my head, my grandfather's voice rang out, deeper and clearer than ever. "Never underestimate what others call worthless, Maya. Sometimes that is the true key." Oh! The cabin appeared before me like an old scar in the snowy forest. The roof sagged like a weary back, the wood stained with patches of black mold. One window had long since shattered, leaving only an empty wooden frame like a hollow eye socket. On the porch, deep claw marks slashed across the door, straight and ragged, almost certainly from a bear searching for food during a past winter. The steps groaned under my weight, each creak echoing into the still forest like a tired sigh. I brushed away the snow, pushed the door open, the hinges shrieking, and a heavy wave of mildew and rot swept into my face. Inside, the fireplace in the corner was rusted, its mouth blackened with old soot. The armchair nearby had collapsed, its cushion shredded by mice, yellowed stuffing spilling out. A small dining table lay under a thick coat of dust, mouse tracks crisscrossing over it. The smell of mold mixed with the stench of old animal droppings made my throat tighten. I dropped my backpack, turned on my flashlight, and swept it across cracked walls, crooked frames of faded photographs. I collapsed into a chair with one broken leg, wobbling as if ready to give out with me. In that moment, everything from Manhattan, from the lawyer's office, from Savannah's smirk, from Derek's contempt came crashing down like a storm. I thought, is this my worth? A rotting shack in the woods? That first night, I unrolled my sleeping bag in the corner of the room where the wind slipped in the least, my back pressed against the moldy wooden wall. I tried to light a fire in the stove, but the coals burned weakly, then died, leaving behind only the acrid smoke that seeped through the room. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, branches snapping with the sharp crack of breaking bones. The roof groaned whenever the gusts hit, each creak sounding like footsteps across the ceiling. I curled inside the sleeping bag, trying to keep warm, but the cold slipped into every fingertip, into every hollow of my bones. In the dark, I heard Derek's voice, pathetic loser. I heard Savannah's, rustic suits you. I heard my father's, what's the point of writing? They circled and repeated over and over. I whispered into the void. Value is only money, isn't it? Then I have nothing. Oh. When I closed my eyes, my grandfather Elias came back to me. The walks we took along the Susitna River, the way he pointed at a drifting log and said, what others throw away may be the thing that lasts the longest. I remembered that final night in Anchorage, when he held my hand and spoke slowly. Never let anyone else decide your worth. I was 18 then and brushed it off with a laugh. But now, lying in this frozen cabin, his words hammered against my heart. The next morning, gray light leaked through the broken window frame, falling across the dusty floor in a pale streak. I sat up, throat dry, body aching all over. My first thought was to sell. I pictured snapping a few photos, sending them to a local realtor, unloading the place cheap to someone wanting hunting land or a shack in the woods. Take the money, go back to New York, and keep living quietly. But when my hand brushed against the envelope in my coat pocket, I remembered the scrap of paper from my mother. "You will know why it had to be you." I stopped. Those words anchored me, keeping me from walking away. I pulled out the leather notebook, set it on the dusty table, and for the first time since arriving in Alaska, I wrote, "Mercer Lot, Hassan 4, Day 1. I began recording every detail. The sagging roof, the shattered window, the rusted stove, the layout of the rooms, the rotting beams. With a trembling but determined hand, I sketched a rough diagram of the cabin. Then I took the old broom propped in the corner and swept a patch of floor clean. Each time I gathered dust and ash into a pile, I thought of my father's eyes skimming past my essay years ago, eyes that never paused on me. Now I was forcing myself to pause, to look at this wood, this cabin, as if I were looking at myself. All morning, I worked through each corner, stacking chairs back in place, brushing away cobwebs, pushing open windows to let cold air replace the stench of mold. I rolled up my sleeves, pulled on gloves, and used a knife to strip away loose splinters of decayed wood. Sweat gathered under my parka, but for the first time in a long time, I felt I was truly in control of something. The cabin did not turn into a mansion, nor into an apology from my parents, but with every clump of dust cleared away, I reclaimed a small piece of myself. I stood in the middle of the bare room, watched the light filter through the hole in the roof, and realized this might not just be about value equals money. Maybe this was a test. Maybe this was where I had to begin again. On the third day of cleaning the cabin, I began to notice something strange on the living room floor. Most of the wooden planks were rotted, gray with age and damp, but right in the center lay one that was different, darker in color, with the grain running the opposite direction. I knelt down, shining my flashlight across it, and saw that it was fixed with old hand-forged nails, big and rough, unlike the industrial steel ones holding the others in place. I tapped it lightly with my fingernail. The sound rang hollow, not solid like the rest. My heart quickened. Instinct told me there was something hidden beneath. I pulled back the dust-covered rug that half concealed the floor. It was thick and heavy, handwoven in faded Alaska Native patterns, likely once belonging to my grandfather Elias. Beneath it, just as I suspected, a rusted iron ring protruded from the corner of the darker plank. I took a deep breath, gripped the ring, and pulled hard. The board gave way with a sharp crack, dust swirling into the air. A dark opening appeared, damp air rising from below, carrying the smell of soil and rusted iron. Beneath the floorboards, a narrow wooden staircase led down into a pit of shadow. I grabbed my flashlight from the backpack and tested the first step. It creaked, but held. I descended slowly, one hand gripping the rough railing. The farther I went, the colder it became, each breath fogging into white clouds. At the bottom, my boots touched stone. The cellar was larger than I expected, its walls built from hand-stacked rock, its ceiling low, the beam of my flashlight cutting across endless dark corners. In one corner, wooden crates were stacked high, each faintly marked with the faded stencil. Mercer Co. in peeling white paint. Beside them stood several metal chests with rusted locks and loose handles. I knelt, rapped on one of the crates. The sound was solid. Using my multi-tool, I pried the lid open, the brittle wood splintered. Inside were heavy cloth sacks, bound tight with rope. I tugged one open and under the flashlight's beam, a golden gleam burst forth. Rows of gold coins lay neatly stacked, heavy in my hand as I lifted one. My breath caught, my grip faltered. I nearly dropped it. I opened a few more sacks, silver bars still gleaming beneath their dust, necklaces set with finely cut stones, jade rings, silver brooches. An entire treasure hoard, so dazzling it made my eyes blur. I stepped back, pressing against the stone wall, my heart pounding. My mind spun between exhilaration and disbelief. Why were these things here? Why had they been hidden beneath the cabin everyone in my family had dismissed as worthless? I swept my flashlight across the cellar once more. At the far end stood a large chest set apart from the rest, its leather covering cracked, the lock rusted but intact. I forced the lid open. Inside were not gold or jewels, but thick, old leather-bound ledgers, their pages yellowed with age. I flipped one open, the handwriting neat, signed, Elias Mercer. Page after page detailed records of timber rights across thousands of acres of forest around Talkeetna, with precise maps of every lot. I opened another book and found lease contracts for lithium, antimony, and even rare earth mineral mining, signed decades ago, complete with annexes of annual royalty payments. The signatures and notarized seals were all legitimate, still carrying legal weight. Another ledger listed ROW agreements, rights of way for pipelines cutting across Mercer land, with fixed rental fees under long-term contracts. My hands trembled as I read the figures, hundreds of thousands of dollars each year. Alongside these, a set of probate documents confirmed the chain of title, showing the land had been passed legally through generations and now, by right, belonged to me. I sat on the cold stone floor, holding a thick ledger in my hands, flipping through page after page. The numbers, the resource values, the acreage, all of it added up to more than I could ever have imagined. A rough calculation showed the gold, silver, and jewelry alone were worth several million. But the timber rights, the mineral leases, and the pipeline contracts were the true magnitude. I pulled out my phone, opened the calculator, and with trembling fingers did the math. The figure that appeared left me breathless. Over $80 million, perhaps more, if valued at today's market rates. I stayed there for a long time in the cellar, my back against the cold stone wall, the ledgers stacked around me like a circle that bound me and shielded me at once. At first, I thought I was shaking from the cold, but then I realized it was from the weight of the truth. Everything I had believed to be rejection might never have been rejection at all. The decaying cabin wasn't a cruel joke, it was a test. And the one my mother had chosen wasn't Savannah, the sister who lived to broadcast every victory online, feeding off admiration. She had chosen me, the daughter who had always been overlooked, but who could stay silent, watch carefully, endure patiently, and keep a secret until the right time. That realization made me want to laugh and cry all at once. My whole life, I had lived under the shadow of comparison, convinced I wasn't enough. And yet, it was precisely that, not enough, which made me the one capable of carrying a treasure that would have evaporated in Savannah's hands after a single season of parties. But with the rush of exhilaration came a tide of heavy questions. Could I keep all of this safe? What would happen if word got out? I pictured Savannah answering the phone, Derek reading the news in the paper, both of them arriving with feigned righteousness, demanding a fair share. I knew my sister wouldn't hesitate to drag me into court, and Derek would spin whatever lies he needed to wedge his way back into my life. That was the first wall I hit: ethics. I didn't want to turn into someone who flaunted wealth, nor did I want to be trapped in the whirlpool of endless legal battles. Next came the question of security. The cabin had no solid lock, and the trapdoor was nothing more than a plank covering the cellar. If anyone wandered in out of curiosity, everything would be exposed. I thought of treasure heist movies, of people who could smell money from miles away and break in without hesitation, and a chill ran down my spine. I knew I had to act immediately. Climbing back up, I drew a long breath and began a temporary plan. First, I reinforced the trapdoor. I found new nails and hinges, hammered them in with a small mallet, and added an iron padlock I had bought in Anchorage. I knew it wouldn't stop someone determined, but at least it gave me a measure of peace at night. Then I selected a few items that could be liquidated easily, a couple of gold bars, some silver coins, an antique necklace, wrapping them carefully in a cloth bag. These I would take back to Anchorage to place in a safe deposit box at the bank. I didn't need to sell them right away. I just needed to know that, in an emergency, I had something to fall back on. The rest of the crates I returned to their places, let the dust settle, and covered the trapdoor with the rug as before. The next task was digitizing. I pulled my laptop from the backpack and carefully scanned every ledger page, every contract, every map. I saved them to an external hard drive, encrypted the files, and locked them with a password. The work took hours, my fingers stiff with cold, but I felt as if I were transforming fragile, flammable papers into proof that could survive time itself. Those scans were my first safeguard, my insurance in case fire or intruders ever found their way to the cellar. I also began keeping an asset journal. In it, I photographed every crate, every piece of jewelry, every document, recording quantities and rough valuations. I noted the dates, even my own feelings as I uncovered each item, because I knew that one day these details might become part of the true family story. I worked with such precision that by the time I finally looked up, the sky outside was already dark and the fire in the stove had burned down to glowing embers. Yet, I didn't feel exhausted. On the contrary, I felt more alive than ever. All the while, I kept reminding myself, don't touch those old contracts without an advisor. I had no idea how Alaska law might treat resource rights signed decades earlier. I didn't want one misstep to cost me everything. So I left every contract exactly as it was in the chest, no changes, no signatures, only reading and archiving. I told myself, be patient, don't rush, let grandfather's memory guide the way. While leafing through one of the thick ledgers, I noticed a thin envelope tucked tightly against the back cover, so faint I first mistook it for lining paper. At the corner of the envelope was handwriting. I recognized instantly the slanted script of my mother, Elaine. My heart lurched, and my hands trembled as I pulled it free. The paper was yellowed, the edges brittle, but still intact. I opened it slowly, afraid that a careless movement might scatter my mother's last words into dust. Inside was a letter written in faded blue ink. The very first line blurred my vision. My dear Maya, if you are reading these words, it means your father and I are already gone. I drew in a deep breath and forced myself to continue. Your father is hot-tempered, and sometimes he hurt you, but you must know he was not blind. He saw in Savannah the sparkle, the quickness that easily convinces the world. But in you, he saw something different. Endurance. Strength that does not need to show itself, only to last long enough to prove its worth. I choked up as I read the next line. We did not choose by noise, we chose by trust. You think you were abandoned, but the truth is we trusted you to have the patience to keep, the quiet strength to protect. This cabin is not a joke, it is our bequest. Believe that we always saw you, even in silence. My tears fell onto the page, blurring my mother's handwriting. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling as if she were right there beside me, whispering that all those years of being overlooked were only a fog masking the truth. I was not the invisible child. I was the one they had chosen. That night I sat by the fireplace, the letter resting on my lap. The flames crackled, and the darkness in the cabin no longer frightened me. A strange peace settled over me. For the first time, I no longer needed an apology from anyone. I had proof that my parents had trusted me, that their silence had not been indifference but faith that I would find the answer at the right time. The next morning, as gray light streamed through the broken window, I turned on my phone after days of avoiding connection. Immediately the screen buzzed with a flood of missed notifications. Among them was Savannah's name. Her message was brief. Enjoying your little shack? Honestly, it probably fits your aesthetic. I read it, then set the phone down. Once, I would have rushed to reply, to argue, to prove I wasn't inferior. But this time, I did nothing. I only smiled faintly and wrote in my notebook. Savannah still thinks I've lost. But for the first time, I know I don't need to answer back. The truth is right beneath my feet. Before I could close the notebook, my phone buzzed again. A message from Derek. Maya, I think we reacted too quickly. I want to talk, maybe meet? I miss you. I stared at the words, remembering the sound of him throwing the ring onto the table, remembering exactly how he called me a pathetic loser in front of the law office receptionist. If I were the old version of myself, I might have given in, clung to that thin thread of hope. But now, with my mother's letter in my hands, proof that I had never been worthless, I understood clearly that Derek was only sniffing out opportunity. He never missed me. He only missed what he thought I could give him. I didn't respond. I locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the table. I took a deep breath and wrote in my notebook, "Derek wants to come back. I choose silence." For the first time, silence was not forced upon me, it was my right. The feeling was so new, it made me shiver. For years, I had been screaming just to be heard, to be seen. Today, I knew that real strength lay in being able to stay silent without feeling lesser. As evening fell, I carefully folded my mother's letter, slipped it into a clear plastic sleeve to protect it, and placed it inside the temporary safe in the cabin. I sat on the porch, looking out at the pine forest buried in snow. The wind whistling through the trees no longer sounded like bones breaking, it was more like a soundtrack to a beginning. A single thought echoed in my mind. I had spent too many years living by the gaze of others. From now on, I would live by the faith my mother left me. And that faith, I would never let be stolen by those who only measured worth by outward shine. The next day, I decided it was time to turn the cabin from a scar into a beginning. I started with the simplest tasks, climbing onto the roof with the old wooden ladder, checking each warped board. I replaced the rotten planks with new ones I had bought in Talkeetna, hammering each nail in despite the cold numbing my fingers. The sound of the hammer rang through the forest like a drumbeat announcing rebirth. I covered the broken window first with a sheet of clear plastic, then gradually replaced it with tempered glass cut by a local craftsman. I built a pinewood shelf to store the ledgers, notebooks, and asset journal. Over the trapdoor, I installed a simple motion sensor wired to a bell, something to alert me if anyone tried to break in. On the main door, I hung a bear horn siren, the kind every Alaskan considered essential. Each small detail made me feel that the cabin was no longer abandoned, it was slowly becoming a space I commanded. As I repaired the place, I realized I too needed rebuilding. I began running in the mornings on the thick snow, each first step heavy but gradually easier as my body adjusted, my breathing more steady. Some days I ran into town, stopping at a small cafe near the Talkeetna Roadhouse. The owner, a native woman named Anna with long black hair, always asked if I wanted hot coffee or herbal tea. One time, I sat and spoke with her about the forest, about how we could keep it alive. Anna told me, "Outsiders often think this land is only resources to be extracted. But for us, it is memory, it is home." Her words planted a new seed of thought in me. I could not see only the money in Elias's ledgers. I had to see the responsibility too. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote out a long-term plan. If I sold the timber rights outright, the land would be stripped bare. Instead, I chose selective logging, harvesting only in rotation and replanting to ensure the ecosystem survived. For the mineral leases, I would only sign agreements that carried strict environmental clauses, requiring ESG audits to minimize damage to the land. I even thought about creating the Mercer Scholarship Fund, using part of the profits to help Native Alaskan children access education. The idea came from Anna's story about her son traveling nearly 2 hours each day just to reach school. I realized I could turn this inheritance into a bridge not just for me to cross, but for others to find opportunity too. Day by day, the cabin grew brighter. I laid down a new rug across the floor, hung a few printed photographs of the forest I had taken myself. At night, I lit oil lamps, the golden glow softening the stains of mold on the wooden walls. I grew accustomed to the silence, the wind, the birds, the distant howl of wolves. Instead of loneliness, I felt peace. In that stillness, I could finally hear my own heartbeat, something that had long been drowned out by the noise of comparison and humiliation. One afternoon, while repairing a window frame, I suddenly thought of Savannah. I pictured her stepping into this cabin, shaking her head, calling it a shack. And then I asked myself, did I need to prove anything to her? The answer came quickly, no. I didn't need loud revenge, I didn't need to flaunt the treasure. I didn't need to boast that more than $80 million lay beneath my feet. What I needed was to prove to myself that I could use it well. My growth wasn't about showing Savannah who had won. It was about knowing I no longer needed to win against anyone at all. That night, I lit the fire and set a kettle on the stove. I pulled out my mother's letter and read it once more. We did not choose by noise, we chose by trust. I sat in silence, listening to the wood crackle, and realized that this choice was my chance to step into a new chapter. I was no longer the Brooklyn girl watching her essay folded under a pizza box. I was no longer the fiancé left behind with the sound of a ring clattering on a table. I was the heir of a legacy, and more than that, I was someone who had reclaimed her own worth through every patched plank, every scanned ledger, every step across the white snow. For the first time in my life, I saw the cabin not as a symbol of abandonment but as my home. A home that held not only treasure in gold and silver, but also the story of my growth, my silence, and the trust I was meant to carry until the end. I knew I couldn't stop with scanned documents and a notebook. To protect this legacy, I needed a legal shield and a circle of trust. I began searching carefully. Savannah and Derek could not catch even a hint of it. In Anchorage, I chose a small land law firm where the lawyers still worked in an old brick building instead of a glass tower. The lawyer's name was Howard, his hair silver, his voice measured. He listened to my account without interruption. Then he checked the chain of title, the ownership trail from my grandfather Elias down to me. Every seal, every signature, he verified as valid. "You hold full legal rights," he said firmly, "but you must be wise enough to keep them." The next step, I invited a mineral appraiser to the cabin. He was native Alaskan, carrying a core drill and geological maps. Together we reviewed the leases in the ledger. When he reached the words, "rare earth," his eyes lit up. "If these contracts are still valid, the value isn't just large, it's enormous," he whispered. I nodded, staying silent, my heart pounding but my face calm. A forester I had called from Fairbanks also arrived. He ran his hand along the trunk of a pine and said, "Selective logging is the wise choice. If you sell it off, you'll strip the forest. But if you preserve it, the forest will sustain you for life." I wrote down every word in my notebook, treating them as a kind of new will for myself. Over the course of several weeks, I gathered a small circle: the land lawyer, the mineral appraiser, the forester, and a federal tax advisor who had once worked for the IRS. He explained estate basis to me, how to legitimize inherited assets without being swallowed by penalties. "The key," he said, "is to be transparent where necessary and anonymous where it matters." With their guidance, I created the Mercer Trust, a trust bearing my mother's family name. The cabin and all rights from the ledgers were transferred into it. We then established a separate LLC to manage mineral operations, shielding me from personal liability. At the same time, I registered a conservation easement on part of the forest, both to protect the land and reduce taxes. And finally, I filed notices to preserve the validity of the old royalty agreements, documents that could bring in millions of dollars each year. Just as I was beginning to settle into a rhythm, an unexpected email appeared. "Derek, I'm in Soho. Please meet me, just 10 minutes. I owe you an apology." I knew he must have caught whispers. People didn't need details. The scent of money alone was enough. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to go, not to give him another chance, but to close the door myself. A small cafe, golden lights. Derek sat waiting, checkered blazer, wearing the expression of a man who had never done anything wrong. When I walked in, he stood, smiling gently. "Maya, I lifted my hand, motioning for him to sit. I sat too, calm, steady, no tremor in my voice. "You don't need to say anything more." I cut him off. "I no longer need to prove anything to you. Not anymore." Then I stood, walked out of the cafe. No slammed doors, no tears, just an old door closed firm, quiet. That was my greatest victory. The following spring, I returned to the cabin. The snow had melted, a small stream burbled behind the house, moss spread thick across the roots of the pines. The cabin was no longer decayed, the roof was strong, the windows gleamed. In the little kitchen, I hung a photo of my grandfather Elias and placed it on the new wooden shelf. Beneath it, I left a letter to myself, written by hand. I no longer live to be chosen, I live to choose. Eventually, family came calling. Savannah phoned, her voice unusually sweet. Maybe we could invest together, reconnect from the start. We're sisters, right? I drew in a breath and replied politely. Savannah, if you want a relationship built on equality, without conditions, I'm willing. But if it revolves around money, then no. On the other end was silence, followed by a long sigh. I knew there would be no tearful reunion. But I also knew that this time, I had drawn a healthy boundary. I sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the Susitna forest. The sunset poured down like liquid honey, painting the cabin in a radiant gold. In my hands was not just an $80 million inheritance. The true value wasn't in rankings, or in proving who was richer, who had won. It was in the leverage to become someone I respected, someone who could stand tall without needing anyone else's nod of approval. I leaned back in the wooden chair, listening to the cool wind weaving through the trees. My mother's voice rose in my mind. We did not choose by noise, we chose by trust. I smiled and whispered, as if to her, I understand now. How? And I want to leave you, the one listening to this story, with a question. Sometimes what looks like exclusion is actually trust, waiting for you to grow into it. If it were you, would you sell everything just to chase applause, or would you guard it and make it better for those who come after you? Where are you listening from, and what choice would you make for yourself?